This hour, back with us once again, the Chief of Police in Battle Creek, Jim Blocker, and Sheriff Matt Saxton, Calhoun County. Gentlemen, good morning to you.
Good morning, Richard.
Welcome back. Richard. We were surmising earlier that this Houston, Texas issue with the lady on the top of the semi was probably not in the police manual about how to deal with that. Not everything is in the manual, is it?
No. We oftentimes we're presented field problems that we have to be creative.
Yes.
In terms of how we handle.
I guess it took them a couple of hours to talk her down. Man.
I'm only guessing they had to be really creative.
That's right. I presume you're right. And it looked like she could have slipped off the top of that truck at any time. That's a safety issue as well to think about in the middle of all that. This is the point. There are all kinds of curveballs that come your way, and they're not all huge headline grabbers either, like a story that we dealt with not long ago, the issue of heroin in our community. And there was lots of talk about the prevalence of it at that particular time. Have you seen that change?
Well, obviously, the heroin issue has not gone away. We continue to have overdoses. We have not had another fatal overdose since our conversation tied to opiates or heroin. But we continue to keep that conversation to the forefront because it still is a very big concern that we are working every angle on.
There was some chatter at the time that story broke 3-4 weeks ago that there might have been a bad batch, quote unquote, that came through that caused this unusual amount of overdoses. Is that still your thinking today?
I think that's a part of the challenge that we're dealing with locally. But again, this is a national problem. We were able to take in a few people into custody that were associated with the bad heroin locally. We have conducted a number of operations, joint operations with the county and the federal authorities to start to really find out who are our key players and our suspects and root them out, if you will. But I think that's only a temporary solution. I think the fact that this is a larger problem, and the county certainly has come together. We've had several meetings already, and we anticipate that we're going to continue those meetings until we can address this issue.
In so far as your experience, your tenure, both of you, have you seen a situation like that before?
With the total number of heroin deaths, during my 23 years in law enforcement here in Calhoun County, I have not seen that high of a rate in that short of a time. But we have seen over the last few years the increase in overdoses with opiate-based pain meds / heroin.
Well, you can see then why this sets off alarms then and uptick in the amount of concern over it.
Well, I think what we're doing is we're dusting off playbooks from the 80s when the crack epidemic hit.
Oh, boy.
And then followed by the meth epidemic, and now we have the heroin epidemic. And many of us are looking at what are the root causes, what are the challenges that we're dealing with, what's canalized people to choose heroin over any other sort of drug or prescription drug. I think we're smarter in terms of what those issues are and why people are going that route. And I think that's given us a much better approach, strategic approach, as we move to address this in the future. But as we said last time, this isn't really an enforcement problem as much of it is a prescription and medical problem. And we need to be at the table to make sure we're all working with one another to address the issue.
And we'll talk more about that in just a second on WBCK 815 WBCK. Chief Jim Blocker and Sheriff Matt Saxton are here. We've been discussing issues of heroin, and as you alluded before the break there, some of that with which you deal is not necessarily illegal drugs, but prescription drugs and abuse of those.
Well, over the last 10 years, we've seen an increase in the use of opiate-based pain meds and the overprescription of those meds. Some of those folks became addicted to those opiate-based pain meds and then are cut off from those, and they turn to the street to the heroin, which is cheaper to get that high that they're addicted to.
Right.
And it's not all doctors that have been over-prescribing. It's a small percentage of them. And some are doing it for greed, for money.
Oh,
I
man.
mean, they're almost legal drug dealers
Mm-hmm.
that are giving bad scripts, and folks are being paid to go in and get those scripts, and they'll take the scripts down to Kentucky and sell them for $5,000 a bottle.
Oh, my gosh. Wow. So this becomes a problem well beyond our boundaries.
As we said, it's a national issue.
Yeah.
More than just a enforcement issue. We'll take a multi-agency, multi-background group working together to take care of the issue.
Now, what about the meth problem then? Meth was in the news just last week, I think, but what are you dealing with more, and what's the more vexing problem, meth or heroin?
Well, I think opioid abuse, heroin abuse, meth abuse, it's all really sort of the same thing. The level of addiction towards the substance and the high that you get from both are in terms of the high that you receive, they're still relatively equivalent. And I think that's what you're seeing is folks are being canalized into both meth, heroin, or opiate, whichever is more prevalent and whichever is more available. And I think, again, it speaks to the broader challenge of where are we able to send these folks? Where are the rehabilitative services? Where are the restorative services? And how do we compel not only not-for-profit hospital social workers, but as well as the state, the Medicare, Medicaid reimbursement programs? All of these things have to come to bear and assist in funding us through this problem, because you still have to pay the bills. We can talk about it, but we still have to come up with a mechanism to get this stuff paid for.
How about addiction treatment courts, drug treatment courts, alcohol courts, and things of that nature? Have they been a help for you?
We've seen great benefits from those courts here in Calhoun County with the county's drug courts and sobriety courts. I don't know the exact number on the sobriety court side of things, but I believe they're up over well over 200 graduates from that, and that's the drunk driving alcohol treatment court. We have not had, in Calhoun County, we have not had a repeat offender that's a graduate of drug court.
Yeah, think about that. So these are essentially, if you're not familiar, a court supervised rehab program. And I mean, there's certain folks who fall into a potential category where they can benefit from this, and the court, and in tandem with law enforcement, has to help figure that out. But as you say, this takes a person who's addicted and puts them through a treatment program whereby now they've graduated from that, and they're not costing the system anymore. They've become contributing members of society now, and you don't see them anymore, which is a huge thing.
It's a great thing for the county and the citizens and the taxpayers that we're not spending that money over and over again. But what we're talking about is we need to look at, even prior to that arrest, how they're going to get the treatment and where they can go to get help on their own, as opposed to taking that arrest or that multiple arrests to finally get help. We need a multifaceted group looking at options. The heroin issue, opiate issues is, again, something that can't be arrested away or prosecuted away or enforced away.
It keeps coming back.
We need to look at those treatment options prior to the arrest.
So is our problem then trying to make those connections happen in our area a greater one than areas of our size elsewhere, as far as you know?
I think the challenge is a challenge of scale. There is a group that are developing strategies and places and potential services for addicts. I know that we've put on our website a lot of information published and gathered by the Substance Abuse Council of Calhoun County, explaining to people where they can get the services that they need. But we also acknowledge that real time, from an everyday operational perspective, whether it's through the emergency room or it's through law enforcement or whether it's through a family member or friend. Where can we take somebody that's in immediate need to work off the high under some sort of supervised care, and then from there, once we pull them out of that low, once they come down off their high, we have some place or program that we can get them involved in.
So there's no place now that does that?
Not right now, nearby, locally. And that's one of the things that I think we're working on and developing.
Interesting.
I've oftentimes seen where mothers or fathers have finally got fed up with their kids' addiction or older adults' addiction and finally called the police to report it so they would get arrested and possibly get that help they need.
Right.
Again,
Seems
we would rather see the help as opposed to arresting them filling up the jail.
Right.
Get the help beforehand.
Using the resources that we have for that purpose,
And again, to make sure that there are many non-for-profit organizations in the community that are doing excellent counseling and, if you will, outpatient work and programs. I think of the Haven. I think of Safe Place. I think of the yeoman's work that Summit Point is doing on a daily basis. But again, I think what we're really talking about here is that immediate need of inpatient care and those services. And then everything that follows are those outpatient care programs.
Chief Jim Blocker's here and Sheriff Matt Saxton as well. We're back in just a moment on WBCK Show. Brought to you 5 WBCK. We're here with Chief Jim Blocker and Sheriff Matt Saxton today. We haven't spoken in a few weeks, and certainly the last time I saw you, the situation in Kalamazoo several Saturdays ago had not happened yet, so this is the first time we're together chatting about it. But I presume that as that situation unfolded, it turned out that it started in the east part of Kalamazoo County and moved west, but the notion that it wasn't clear where these things were going to happen next. Are neighboring counties alerted when things like that are going on?
So what was interesting about that is that it really occurred in, there were, 4 different scenes, and I would almost say in 3 phases. There was the first phase in Richland Township that happened, and then there was a follow-on incident that happened at the dealership in Kalamazoo. And again, these are 2 separate jurisdictions. And then there was a gap of about 3 hours or so or more, and then there was another follow-on incident where the 2 shootings occurred. And I have to tell you, one of the challenges is that they had, I think initially, was they didn't know it was a continuous ongoing event with the same suspect.
Have to recognize
I think
that.
they had to recognize first that's what we have. Normally, when we have an active violence event, an active shooter event, we have one event in one place with one or multiple shooters, and then everybody surges to that threat, and we respond to it. This was slightly different, and that's what made it such an anomaly, but what made it also dangerous. There is routinely communication, if not agency to agency, or through the law enforcement network, but also through dispatch centers. And there was communication, but it wasn't until everyone realized we have an ongoing and continuous event that everyone started talking about it. Again, you alluded to it earlier with the woman on the semi in Texas, I believe.
Right.
You know, we're presented unique field problems, and we have to be able to have a broad array of strategies and tactics in terms of dealing with them. And this was certainly unique and also tragic.
For sure. Once the 2 of you were aware that that situation, those scenes were related, the suspect hadn't been apprehended yet, does that put you in a position where you have to start looking for the description of that car in Calhoun County? Maybe that car was here.
Well, what it does is it puts us at more or less a defensive posture, if you will. So folks then start looking for a vehicle. Certainly, I think units were moved towards that county borderline just to see if they can assist. But at the same time, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. All you can do is deploy units as best as you can. We certainly didn't surge because it really didn't come across as something like that until much later in the night, and then it had just about ended.
So has that situation prompted discussions in this county about how to respond to those kinds of things?
Well, I think the things that law enforcement did in California or Kalamazoo was phenomenal. The multi-agencies working together, And fortunately, we have that here in Calhoun County. We communicate on a daily basis when issues arise, and when no issues are taking place.
Sure.
We continue to talk, all the law enforcement agencies here in Calhoun County.
And you talked about the dispatch situation. We're consolidated here in Calhoun County. That's something that Kalamazoo has struggled with for a long time. It sounds like they're sorting it out, but that helps your communication potential.
We're fortunate here in Calhoun that every 911 call that is made in Calhoun County goes to one central location, and typically has one or two call takers, but everybody in that same room knows the calls that are coming in.
Right. And what if it wasn't that way? How then would the communication between your departments happen?
You know, it would still happen.
Yeah.
You know, the professionalism of our dispatch community is still very high, and I know that they would continue to reach out and routinely call, just as we do now with area counties that are not a part of our Calhoun County Consolidated Dispatch. But what's unique here is exactly what the sheriff said, is that they'll identify an issue and they quickly start cross-talking from one console to another. They even have the technical capability to merge radio channels if we have to during a critical incident. So I think we've established an excellent foothold in terms of our technological capability, and I know that Kalamazoo is working really hard to get the same thing over there.
Yeah, and I presume to have your counterpart in the same room with you to be able to have that communication in the dispatch center is a lot easier than if you're in two different places and now you have to relay that somehow and communicate from different locations. It just makes a big difference, I presume.
That's exactly right.
We appreciate the time as always. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Richard.
Chief Jim Blocker and Sheriff Matt Saxton on WBCK 8.